Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Rausen Pereira. India has seen protracted river water sharing disputes in recent years. Depleting groundwater, drying rivers and increasing demand for water have led to long legal wrangles between warring states. But very soon, India might have a single national tribunal, the Interstate River Water Disputes Tribunal, to arbitrate interstate water disputes. Its recommendations will be binding on the competing parties. Over the years, there have been several tribunals hearing disputes between states on river water sharing, but they have not been able to effectively resolve the disputes in a time-bound manner. While there are suggestions for reconsidering and reviewing the structuring and functioning of the tribunals, there is also a need to look for an alternative mechanism based on environmental thinking to resolve such disputes effectively, amicably and sustainably. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze the Interstate River Water Disputes Amendment Bill of 2019 and how the setting up of a single tribunal will help in resolving river water sharing issues. Joining me on the program today are J. Sai Deepak, Advocate of the Supreme Court, Srinivas Chokkakula, Fellow, Center for Policy Research, S. Masood Hussain, former Chairman, Central Water Commission, and Ashok Bagaria, Legal Editor, Hindustan Times. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Yes, Deepak, I'd like to begin the program with you. Let's first try and understand what the Interstate River Water Disputes Amendment Bill of 2019 is and your thoughts on the bill.
So, it's important to understand the backdrop in which this entire thing is actually being mooted. So, you have two legislations which have been promulgated under the Constitution to deal with water related disputes. One is the River Boards Act and the other is the IRWD Act of 1956, which came about after the reorganization of the states in 1956. Now, the first legislation is primarily meant to create a body which is meant to advise government on river basins and particularly when projects are set up. Whereas the second one is basically meant to address issues of interstate water disputes. Now, the structure and this particular legislation is a consequence of Article 262. Now, since we are discussing the problems or let's say the challenges or the advantages of the bill that has been proposed, it is very interesting to note that in the Constituent Assembly, when the discussion was mooted with respect to addressing these disputes, they did not have in mind a law which allows the central government to set up any kind of tribunal. In fact, they wanted presidential reference for these kind of issues to avoid politicization of these issues or perhaps delay. So, this was one of the things that was actually suggested in the Constituent Assembly debates. However, subsequently, Dr. Ambedkar said that it's perhaps best that we go with the Parliament which has the power to enact laws with respect to this, and as a consequence of which, the original Article 242A translated to Article 262, under which these bills are actually passed and these laws are made. Now, under the current legislation as it stands, each time a problem with respect to or a dispute with respect to sharing of river or any kind of issue with respect to river between two states arises, it translates to a complaint for the constitution of a tribunal. Now, if you look at the history of the timelines taken to constitute these tribunals for each of these disputes, it has taken in some cases 6 years, 7 years, 10 years, 20 years. So, these are the timelines that you have seen. Now, under the legislation, once the dispute is resolved by the tribunal, it has to be then notified by the government as part of the official gazette. That's the practice. And then it attains the status of a decree or an award by the Supreme Court, almost at par with that. And therefore, you do not have access to the Supreme Court over and above that. But still, you have seen matters going to the Supreme Court, citing violation of fundamental rights under Article 21 or Article 32, so on and so forth. And you have seen each of these matters landed before the Supreme Court at one point or the other. Now, the one thing that the bill tries to achieve, from what little I have understood of it based on the press note, is that it tries to reduce the time it takes to constitute a tribunal, creates a permanent infrastructure, and in addition to that, like most commercial disputes today, there is, let's say, a pre-litigation dispute resolution process which is attempted for a period of 18 months with the central government playing the role of an arbitrator, and if that issue is not being resolved in a period of 18 months, then it gets referred to the tribunal as a dispute for it to be taken up.
Sure.
So, this is what I understand of the bill at this point of time. So, having a permanent body, a permanent office and a running tribunal is certainly useful without a doubt. But the question that you still have to ask yourself is, in addition to that, what can you do to speed in the process of implementation and resolution once the matter is referred and the tribunal is constituted for that particular dispute?
Absolutely. Right. So, Mr. Hussain, I'd like to bring you into the picture now. So, how will a single tribunal help in sorting out the issue? What is it that it's going to do differently that the other tribunals have not done?
See, the basic features, my colleague has already illustrated that there is now going to be a single tribunal if the act is passed, and then the delay is because of the appointment of the members, means the judges of the Supreme Court and High Court and the assessors. So, I mean, those delays, because now we are going to have a permanent tribunal, so there will be benches. So, one bench can look after more than one issue or one dispute. So, the process will be you can say expedited, and so far as the process is concerned, now the timelines have been reduced. In the present, the proposed bill, the duration has been reduced from the earlier period to this dispute resolution committee will take 1 year, extendable by 6 months, so 1.5 years. Then the main report will be prepared in 2 months. That means the entire deliberations and argumentation and all those things, 2 years, extendable by 1 year, so total 3 years. And then the clarification which is required, that has to be decided within 1 year, extendable by 6 months. So, this time the timelines have been fixed. Earlier there was no timeline so far as the clarification was concerned. So, it used to take, although the time for this one was there for clarification, but for the main report, but for the clarification 1 year, and then there was no limit to the extension. So, it kept on lingering, and as my colleague mentioned, it has taken a long. So, the process basically remains the same, the judicial process, but now the formation of a single tribunal, it will reduce the delays, and the present arrangement, that will speed up the process.
Right. Yes, Ashok Bagaria.
See, I just wanted to add one thing, that it's nice to have a single tribunal like if we can draw a parallel between this tribunal which is being conceived by the central government and the Armed Forces Tribunal. So, it's going to have one permanent bench and got some other benches in various parts of the country. So, you could have a southern bench, you could have a western and an eastern bench, and the work gets delegated to this bench, and that's how the water disputes get attended to in a faster and a quicker manner. But besides this, there is a very important question, is that increasingly of late we are seeing that interstate water disputes is one of the biggest challenge the Indian federalism faces, in the sense that there is so much infighting between the states, and the tempers and emotions run so high that it actually spills over from the borders of the states. So, in the past we have seen the Kaveri water dispute, how the tempers have run very high between Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, and moreover there has been increasing politicization of the issue also. What this tribunal does is only address the infrastructure and architectural mechanism. It puts an architectural mechanism in place to deal with the legal issues arising out of this matter. But water as a subject is more than just a legal issue. It's a very emotional issue, and in the days to come, what we can foresee is that it's going to get much bigger and bigger.
Absolutely. Water is the elixir to life. So, we'll have to take this issue on seriously and with the war footing really to try and deal with it, because we have to take into consideration the emotions as well, is what the panelists are suggesting. Let me go across to Srinivas Chokkakula now, who's been patiently listening to all the other panelists as well. Do we need a change in policies really as far as dealing with such kind of issues are concerned, because of the kind of emotions that are attached, because politicians also do their part in flaring up the emotions on the ground? Do we need an out-of-the-box idea really to deal with this particular issue?
Well, certainly we do need beyond legalist solutions. In fact, what this particular amendment bill was, in fact, just to be clear, it was first introduced in 2017 or 2018 in the Parliament. and there was a parliamentary committee that looked into it, and there were certain modifications that were made. I think this is going to be reintroduced now in the parliament after the cabinet's approval. So we do not know exactly if there have been any modifications, but our own comments are based on what we have seen in the bill that was earlier introduced. So to respond to your question, yes, certainly. In fact, particularly interstate water disputes, in the sense like there is a larger term which is interterritorial disputes, are very complex disputes. It's not adequate to have a legal solution itself. So what we are offering through this amendment bill is just a legal solution. But you also need others, supplementing responses in terms of first policy. When I say policy, you need to have a certain kind of federal consensus among the states that there is a certain role that the center can play, particularly when you want to look at the way the dispute resolution committee is going to function. We need to see what kind of gravitas that you can attach to this disputes resolution committee to enable certain level of possible resolution even before it was referred to the tribunal. The second one is what Mr. Desai has actually mentioned, is actually you need to also think about what kind of ex post solutions do you need, and these need to be in the form of institutional solutions. Do we have robust models for implementing an award that is given by the tribunal? We can't really confidently say that we have a solid model. So we need to complement with other kind of solutions as well. And that is something that remains a challenge. In spite of the fact that this particular bill is certainly going to improve the resolution process. When I say resolution, adjudication process and getting an award. But will it lead to permanent resolution is a question that remains.
Absolutely. I'm going to take the points that Srinivas has made forward with you, Sai. The question is, there have been several tribunals in the past. They have all awarded their verdicts really with whatever the water sharing has been with any of the states.
Right.
But implementation has been the problem. Who is going to implement the order or the judgment passed by any of these tribunals, and how do you deal with that kind of an issue?
So I think one of the issues that we discussed the last time when the Kaveri issue was actually resolved was there has been absolutely no mention of any disincentive for somebody to disobey the order of the highest court of the land in that particular dispute. So if the award or decree or a judgment of the Supreme Court does not have any kind of sanctity and does not inspire the fear that is expected to for let's say disobedience, I don't know what is it that you can actually do, particularly because when it comes to these kind of disputes, as I said the last time, it is political muscle that plays a huge role and somebody's ability to create ruckus or rouse the passions of people. But the one thing that I think we have to actually speak of and discuss very, very actively is, apart from disputes, let's say water disputes, can we actually treat this as part of the larger water policy that India perhaps must revisit at this point of time, given the acute paucity of water that we're seeing across the country? And that effectively means it ties into farming policy as well. So it's very, very difficult to look at any of these issues in silos because they are not walled gardens. Each of these affect the other. At the end of the day, you're talking of nature. Therefore, there is a certain level of interdependence. Okay. So first question should be, what is the policy relook that we need when it comes to resolution of these disputes? Second would be, what are the kind of disputes that we are currently faced with? Third would be the kind of dispute resolution mechanism that you want to have in place, which minimizes the role for politicians to play mischief. Fourth would be the question of implementation once there is a final adjudication. And 5, is there a review on a regular basis? Once the order is implemented, what are the implications? Because at the end of the day, you're dealing with nature. What you think you actually implement and what you think is the right solution may not be the right solution. Therefore, what does it call for is serious data-based support that each of these issues calls for. This is not plain and simple inter partes adversarial litigation. This is heavily data-based. Therefore, what is the kind of data support that these tribunals are going to get, or this particular tribunal is going to get, to ensure that it has all the let's say variables at its disposal to make an informed decision? So for instance, if you look at the Competition Commission of India, you have an array of experts, particularly when it comes to market related issues, economics and whatnot. This tribunal too needs regular support of this kind and institutional support, so that because at the end of the day, this is not just an adjudicative tribunal, it plays even an investigative role. It has an investigative power.
Yeah, it does.
Therefore, what kind of resources are being made available to it? What departments are being made available to it? What kind of technology is being made available to it? So, this is something that perhaps we need to consider for a holistic review of this entire issue.
Absolutely. And taking the discussion forward and talking about another aspect, Mr. Hussain, we've stressed enough about how this is a sensitive issue, this is an emotive issue. Keeping that in mind, is there a way that we can get the warring parties to cooperate?
Yeah. See, the cooperation is the most important thing. And I mean, when we talk of the policy issues and the policy framework, first we should try to see this issue in the context that we should try to avoid the conflict. So, for that, what needs to be done is that the planning of projects and planning of water resources schemes should be based on basin level, and for that river basin organizations are the need of the hour. In fact, the Ministry of Water Resources, now Ministry of Jal Shakti, the river basin organizations have been under consideration for a long time. Now the ministry is ready with the river basin management bill. In fact, that process will in a way will be able to bring all the party states of a basin at one table, and that will be headed by Chief Minister of one of these states on a rotation basis. It will be having a technical secretariat with all the engineering and other environmental other experts in this. Central Water Engineering Service officers will be playing an important role there. So, I mean, first let us do the basin planning first. This and for planning as well as for implementation of these projects, these river basin organizations or river basin authorities. So, in a way that this arrangement will be very, very important, and this will help in avoiding the conflicts. So, I mean, we should not allow the conflict to develop. Of course, once the conflict has developed, of course, I mean, so far, I mean, because these are river basin organizations are yet to be formed, but where the tribunal has given the judgment, my friend was talking about the arrangements regarding the implementation. Yes, there are arrangements, like in case of Narmada, this is the Narmada Control Authority. In case of Kaveri Water Management Authority, Kaveri Basin, this Kaveri Water Management Authority has been formed. In fact, I, as Chairman Central Water Commission, acted as its chairman till 30th June. So, the framework is there, and of course, that the implementation certainly depends upon the cooperation of the state, because ultimately, if the decision of the authority is not being implemented or adhered by one of these states, the option for the authorities go to the central government, as what has been said by the Supreme Court. So, ultimately it is the cooperation of and that we have to bring that culture of cooperation among these states.
Absolutely. So, Srinivas Chokkakula, what brings me to my next question is, so have efforts been made, outside of the tribunal's framework to try and deal with this particular issue and try and sort out, disputes between two states as far as water sharing is concerned?
Well, I wouldn't say there are efforts made, but there is states have come together voluntarily and got into agreements. Many viewers as well as panelists might be surprised if you look at the track record of India in terms of interstate water cooperation. I mean, we always focus at, how many disputes do we have so far? We have had something like 9 disputes, interstate disputes, water disputes. You can't even guess the number of interstate water cooperation agreements that are in place. I mean, Mr. Hussain knows it, and the Central Water Commission has compiled more than 160 agreements between the states. So there are certain factors that contribute to the states to think about working together. Now, the problem at this moment is that we don't know what precisely that makes states to contribute. Now, just keeping that in mind, if you look at the history of interstate water, river water governance, our response has always been contingent and crisis driven. If you look at, both what Mr. Desai has said, both the legislations, the River Boards Act and the Interstate River Water Disputes Act, both of them came in 1956. So if you look at how we have improved these legislations, the Interstate River Water Disputes Act has been amended several times, perhaps more than a dozen times. This is probably 13th or 14th. Whereas if you look at River Boards Act, which is supposed to enable cooperation, hasn't even been touched so far. In fact, now it is happening by the proposal of replacing the River Boards Act with the River Basin Management Act. So there are, if you look at it, the role that the center can play in terms of resolving these disputes has been sort of neglected, because it's only just responded to the every time the dispute emerges or otherwise recurs, center comes into play. Otherwise, there hasn't been an ecosystem that has been put in place to enable states to work together, in spite of the fact that they are working together on their own. So
Right.
that is something that one needs to focus in order to make this resolution also to succeed.
Absolutely.
So, there is a larger ecosystem that one needs to look at. It's not just about resolution of disputes.
Sure. So, Ashok Bagaria, at some level, have we failed in enabling and supporting the existing tribunals?
Well, if you look, personally speaking, yes, I would say yes, we have failed, because we have largely kept the political people out of this whole process. What I personally feel is that when we talk of any adjudication process, there is an award, there is a question of implementation, that is the most important one. I personally feel that when it comes to implementation, and considering that water is such a sensitive issue, you need to have some sort of involvement of the political leadership, because at the end of the day, the political leadership is the representative of the people, and they are the ones who actually incite emotions, and they are the ones who can actually control it. And moreover, as far as the question of fear is concerned, there should be some, while implementing a decision, some kind of a fear should be there in the minds of the political representative or the chief executive officer or the chief minister of that particular state, whatever we call them, that they could be hauled up for contempt. So that is one way of ensuring that the particular award gets implemented. So far, there have been attempts in the past. We have seen that contempt proceedings have been initiated against the chief secretaries of the state, the chief ministers, but nothing really happens. We have had awards, we have had water tribunals functioning for the last 3 or more than 3 decades, and nothing has come out of it. Now that we'll have a new infrastructure in place, a permanent sort of a body which will adjudicate on water disputes, we need to ensure that there is some degree of political participation also into it, and there should be some clarity on the issue as to what exactly is a water dispute. There could be a state where the drinking water requirements are far higher than the agricultural needs of a next or a neighboring state. So they need to be clearly defined. So for instance, one particular state might have very little rainfall in one particular season, and they need to supply drinking water to their particular state. They cannot, the other state cannot force the first state to release water for their agricultural need. So that kind of a negotiation or some sort of a balancing act needs to be put in place, and for that clearly some kind of political participation is needed.
Okay, all right. Closing comments now from all my guests, starting first with you. Mr. Hussain.
Just to elaborate his point, the formation of the River Basin Organization or the River Basin Authorities, which has been proposed, that definitely takes into account the political participation, because these are supposed to be headed by the chief ministers of the concerned state by rotation, and there will be members will be the ministers from water resources from the concerned states and other officers. So at the level of the planning itself, those issues will get discussed and resolved, because so far there is no forum for discussion about the water issues as such. So the formation of river basin organizations, which is proposed under the River Basin Management Act, will be a very, very effective mechanism for avoiding the disputes and in a way resolving those issues those disputes within the you can say the framework of the river basin organization.
All right, closing comments from all my guests, starting first with you, J. Sai Deepak, with the best way forward.
So the one thing that my own experience over the last few weeks has told me is environment is really going to present itself as a huge challenge to us in the coming years, particularly with our increasing water needs, increasing industrialization. So perhaps all of this is only telling us that when we have a mandate which is perhaps one of the single largest mandates that we have seen in living history in the last 20-30 years, that mandate should be used to perhaps usher in certain serious policy reforms when it comes to these kind of issues. I certainly believe that what has been proposed through this amendment is necessary, but it is more infrastructural, as one of the panelists put it, as opposed to policy oriented. So I think this is the time to usher in these kind of reforms. Environment needs a huge attention, and I think responding to it at the stage of crisis is not the best way to go about it, particularly when I think these kind of issues also have unfortunately a bearing on national integration, as we have seen in the past few years.
Right.
So when access to resources translates to an angst between two communities or two different states and is capable of propelling vociferous sentiments, then I think you need to pay a bit more of attention at the most fundamental level possible, as opposed to just the infrastructural level.
Sure. Srinivas, Chokkakula, best way forward?
Well, you see, there is the best way, if you talk about just this bill, I think the key element is going to be the way the DRC, the Dispute Resolution Committee, is going to be composed. As I said, it needs to have adequate gravitas, and it needs to have adequate support and the right kind of mix of people to bring these states together and see and to a table and see ways of working together or resolving differences. You know, the danger if you let it to go to the adjudication is that, in spite of the fact that we have put in time limits in terms of at the most giving all the allowable extensions, it may take about 5.5 years.
Right.
But it is still open for litigation before the Supreme Court, particularly after the 2018 decision by the Supreme Court.
Sure.
So we might end up getting into perpetual litigation if we don't strengthen these spaces where we can draw on deliberative force to resolve these disputes, instead of thinking about any coercive measures to make states fall in line. So we need to start thinking about possible ways of supporting this legalist process,
right,
legal resolution process with adequate deliberative processes.
Sure. Ashok Bagaria.
I personally believe that as far as this whole problem is concerned, you need to deal with it at an awareness level. There has to be some kind of awareness which has to be created between the warring states, or rather the states between which this dispute arises, so that there is some kind of an awareness amongst the people at the grass or at the grassroots levels. So, and secondly, most important thing is data collection.
Right.
So you need to have a good and a healthy data or over a period of years which will actually keep in mind that what is the rainfall that particular region has got, what is the amount of water that is available, what are the needs of that particular state. So if these things are taken in the totality, awareness and data collection will go a long way,
right,
in preventing. I think the another way of looking forward is that to prevent these disputes in the first place,
sure,
would actually help in reducing this interstate disputes.
Okay, very limited time. So Mr. Hussain, quick closing comment from you.
Yeah, I mean, so far as the data is concerned, data is by and large available. So it is more that sometimes because of the political reasons, these disputes get exaggerated, in the sense that, I mean, I can quote the example of this Mahanadi Tribunal. I mean, personally, I felt that there should not have been a need of a Mahanadi Tribunal, in the sense that the Mahanadi basin is a water surplus basin. The studies which have been carried out in case of Mahanadi, these clearly indicate that 10 billion cubic meters of water is surplus,
Right.
because we studied for the interlinking of rivers. So, but despite that, most of the water is flowing into the sea. Despite that, these states insisted that there should be. So, I mean, there are certain things which are not, you can say, which are not technical, which are not, I mean, demanded by the situation, but of course.
But they still happen. So politics
Yeah.
should be kept out of it, is what you're suggesting. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. We'll see you again next time.